My talk is called Failing History, which is sort of a metaphor or bad joke on my part. The title and subsequent presentation is not about or directed at the people learning history, but the people teaching history. Over the course of my presentation, I hope it will become clear what I mean when I say, quote, we're failing history, specifically why we're failing it when we try to teach it, and how we can go about fixing it. So, background. My name is Ethan Clow, and I work for the Center for Inquiry. We are an educational charity that promotes and advocates for skepticism, critical thinking, scientific literacy, church-state separation, and humanist values. I also do a radio show podcast called Radio Free Thinker out of CITR at UBC. And the mandate of the show is quite similar to my job, but the interesting aspect is that we don't just apply skepticism to science, but everything. Politics, religion, civil liberties, especially history. This is important because my background is actually history. It's been what I've studying for about the past 5-6 years, and it's something that I'm very passionate about. And a lot of people seem to expect me to have a background in science. When I tell them that I don't have a background in science, they're kind of annoyed and angry at me. I don't know why. I think it's because when they think of history, they don't think of skepticism. They think of old historians sitting in a smoke-filled room talking about how great the British Empire was or something. And that's really not what historians do. So I'm kind of disturbed that I don't see skepticism and critical thinking being thought of when it comes to history. And hopefully that maybe I can change some minds out there. So I want to talk about the perceptions of history, and this will help us understand why we're failing history. From other fields like science or any other of the humanities, from the general public, especially the students, it's really important to understand how they see history. And from general academia outside of history, the perception is that history is essentially too biased, or that history does not use an error-proof method of inquiry like the scientific method. To the general person, the general public, the students especially, history is boring. It's not relevant to our modern lives. And worst of all, it doesn't engage anyone. Students don't feel any connection to the material. It's taught for the sake of students having something to do, Fridays afternoon, when they could be here learning about skepticism. The problems that this creates is that students lose interest in history. The discipline itself suffers. The lessons and ideas that history can provide are lost or ignored. The old quote that those who do not learn the mistakes of the past are doomed to repeat them may sound kind of high and mighty, but it's actually kind of true. There are other lessons that history offers as well, and one of the aspects of history is this shared collective heritage that we all can call our own. And this heritage informs us on where we've been and where we're going. And if we forget that, we forget what we're capable of. And unfortunately, we're capable of really horrible things. So it's awful if we lose that. Another problem is that incorrect information is passed on as though it were fact. And skeptics, I think, all agree that it's better to be right than it is to be wrong, or at least be mostly right. The consequences of incorrect information going out to the public as though it were correct is disastrous. The consequences are so large that I could not possibly list them all. But I mean, just consider, for instance, how much history plays a role in the decisions that we make. Everything from which political party we support, or our views on poverty and economics, or war and democracy. These are ideological decisions, to be sure, but they're informed by our perception of what came before. And it's so pivotal that history should be based on reality and not pseudo-history. And as a final point there, as the quality of history drops, we could see a drop in the quality of students who should be going into the workforce. And yes, historians do go into the workforce. We don't just all become history teachers. A lot of historians put their use of analyzing material, looking at evidence, coming up with conclusions, evaluating arguments, they go into policy decisions. They work for the government, they work for the private sector, and they help design policy. And if they're poorly trained, the policy that they're going to advise on, that's going to get followed through and put into action, is going to suffer just as much. So it's very important that we fix these problems. Otherwise, we're in a lot of trouble. So are these perceptions about history, are they justified? Well, yes, but also no. They're justified because not only are students saying history is boring and that history isn't engaging, but that's what the evidence also suggests. Now, where is this evidence coming from? It's coming from university professors and college professors. To give you an example, English professors, they don't assume that their first-year students were mistaught Romeo and Juliet. Mathematics professors don't assume that their first-year students were mistaught algebra. But for history teachers, they assume that students out of high school have been mistaught history. That is the only profession that does that. This is a quote from James Loewen in his book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. Indeed, history is the only field in which the more courses students take, the stupider they become. That's pretty damning. That's awful. And I've sat through so many history courses over the years, and it's amazing how uninformed high school students are about research and method. And this is not because they're lazy or something. It's because they haven't been taught this. What they were taught was, when was the Battle of 1812 fought? And why is it important that we have French on our currency? What? They don't know how to research. They don't know how to document their sources. They don't know how to write a paper. They don't know anything. They come to their professors afterwards, and it's embarrassing to have a whole class dedicated to how to use proper documentation. That's embarrassing. So some of these problems, they are justified. Now, some aren't, though. Not all of these problems are really actually all that bad. The notion of subjectivity is wrong. Perceptions that history is completely subjective or that historians are inherently biased demonstrate a misunderstanding of the historic method. The standard way of looking at this is you say something like, history is written by the victors, or that, like my example of historians sitting in a smoke-filled room reminiscing about the glory days of the British Empire. That is something of a caricature. It's not how history is done. And honestly, you can make the argument that this is exactly the kind of thing that historians have to fix. This can be seen as the historian's fault for not making it clear that history even has an error-correcting method akin to the scientific method. Now, we don't call it the scientific method, of course, but it's very close to it. It's a process of answering questions about the past, making a hypothesis, and seeing what the evidence suggests. So here's an example. You got here a question. Why did the Roman Empire fall? So you make a hypothesis. The Roman Empire fell because of barbarian invasions. Then you do some research, you do some analysis, you look at the evidence, and you find out, well, is my hypothesis on? Is it way off the mark? And then you make a conclusion. That's inquiry. That's what history is all about. If history was subjective, we could show two historians the same data. In this case, the Roman Empire fell because of barbarian invasions, and they would come to different conclusions. Now, generally, assuming that we actually have two good historians, they won't. They'll come to the same conclusion. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, Ethan, I'm sure I've heard two historians disagreeing based on the same data, and you probably have. But typically with history, we don't have, quote, slam dunk evidence. We're never going to have something like this, for instance. Typically, historians have many documents that they piece together, and they don't often agree on the correct placement. It's sort of like a big puzzle. But that's legitimate discourse. That's informed by evidence. It's not usually two people just screaming at each other for the sake of being jerks. So some of these perceptions, they're misinformed. Some of them are on the mark, some of them are misinformed. So where are we failing? Where exactly are we failing? One of them is heroification, and that's a word that I made up. And it means that we're basically taking flesh and blood human beings and we're turning them into superheroes. Now why is this bad? Well, it robs history of credibility. It's factually incorrect, and it censors academic debate and legitimate scholarly research. It silences important aspects of the past that are worthy of attention and research. That's Thomas Jefferson, right? Let's talk about Thomas Jefferson. What do we think about when we think about Thomas Jefferson? You know, he was in many ways a man of the Enlightenment. He was brilliant. He embraced many of the ideas of skepticism and humanism. Yet here was a man who owned slaves and who stood behind one of the most abhorrent institutions ever conceived, organized slavery. Few American textbooks will actually ignore this fact, but they always try to minimize it. They try to make it sound like Jefferson wasn't unique in having slaves, that he was some kind of victim of his times, as though slavery was some kind of accident that he bumbled into. Jefferson was not a benevolent slave keeper. This is a quote that Jefferson wrote in the final chapter of Laws in his Notes on the State of Virginia, a very important American document. I advance it therefore as suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to the whites in the endowment of both body and mind. That's pretty harsh. And he went further than that too. Jefferson was, in many ways, a forward thinker when it came to racism. His ideas of solving the racial problem was not emancipation, but deportation. And that's not because he felt bad for the slaves, but he thought that they were so inferior, they had no place in American society. He was known to beat his slaves, and he would sic bounty hunters on those that escaped. And he applied his vast intellect and scholarly effort to justify slavery. This is rarely mentioned in the history of the United States. Now, does this mean that we strike all mention of Jefferson from the history books? Do we go out of our way to destroy his reputation? No. The antidote to heroification is not demonization. It's rational skepticism. What that means is we have to recognize that Thomas Jefferson was a human being with faults and wrong ideas. We don't